All right, welcome back to another 10th Ed Core rulebook. We're going to go over aircraft and hover rule. This is going to be a weird one. So, for aircraft, there's a whole bunch of changes that is kind of bringing them all in line together and also being treated as a really odd unit um, that we're kind of used to, I guess. So for aircraft, they're all forced to start in reserves. This is regular reserves, not strategic reserves. However, as soon as the game starts, they then get moved to strategic reserves at the start of the game. So we already, right out the gate, have a weird thing. Basically, what this means is they count as strategic reserves. However, they won't apply to your points cap for strategic reserves, but they're going to act like a strategic reserve other than a point cap all the time, because as soon as the game starts, they are actually a strategic reserve. So they still won't be able to come in until turn two. They're going to have to be within the edge of the map thing. So there's a lot to it, but just keep in mind that the points cap doesn't really apply to your aircraft. Okay, so all aircraft across the board, it says in the rule book, not on the data sheet. It may also say there, but all aircraft have a new move stat of 20 inches or more for a normal move. And the way this is worded is basically they only ever get to normal. They don't fall back or anything like that. That's all pretty much the same as we dealt with before. But the way it's worded is they have a minimum of 20 inches to move, and there is no maximum. You could go a billion inches if you really decided to take a car ride. Um, Also, one of the bigger changes is that we are used to, for many editions now, that you take your pivot move first and then you move in a straight line. They have changed it for this edition. Now move in a straight line first and then pivot 90 degrees. So this is actually pretty scary for flyers, because that means your opponent has a very good idea of where your line of travel is, so they can do a lot more in the way of trying to block you. Because the aircraft, while they ignore a lot of models because they have fly and stuff like that, they still can't land on enemy models. So there's going to be a weird thing if your opponent actually has a real option to probably hinder themselves and put themselves in a position they don't necessarily want to be in, but they're doing it so that they can kind of mess with your flyer and maybe force you off the board. Um, so speaking of forcing off the board, if you can't make your move, the minimum 20 inches, without landing on someone, or you hang over the edge, then you are automatically put back into strategic reserves. So your plane doesn't just blow up, which is nice. If they are able to move block you, you just get put back into strategic reserves, and you can come back the following turn. That's a whole turn off of having your guns. But this is a lot of changes packed into a pretty small paragraph. Um, so one of the things that we have to kind of talk about is GW has done pretty good as far as I can tell with the core rulebook. However, as is always, there's an issue or two. And this is where we see our first major issue that is going to command and errata. It's a really easy fix. So if you're playing casually, it's really not that big a deal. We all know what's going to happen. But the way it's worded right now is when you come in from strategic reserves, you count as making a normal move. However, it basically just says you poof into place. You set up in that position. You don't actually move, even though you count as making a normal move. The problem with this is for aircraft, it says regardless of whether or not they make a normal move, if they don't meet their 20-inch minimum, they also go back into strategic reserves. So rules is written right now, your aircraft is going to come onto the field via strategic reserves, recognize at the end of the reserve step that it hasn't moved its minimum 20, and immediately go back into strategic reserves. We know this isn't what GW intended, right? So it's very easy if you're playing casually, you just want to learn the addition. All it's going to require is them put in errata with a single sentence that says when an aircraft comes in via strategic reserves, it counts as having met its minimum move distance. Um, we know that's coming. But as is right now, there is that little sentence that seemed to be missed. So moving on to some of the aircraft will have the hover rule. Hover rule is very different this edition than we've ever seen in the past. So hover is declared just before you deploy during your declare battle formations step. When you declare hover, your aircraft loses the aircraft keyword. And basically, for the rest of the game, it's treated like a normal vehicle with a keyword. It loses aircraft, it doesn't have a minimum 20, things like that. Instead, it gets deployed like normal. It doesn't have to go into reserve, but you are allowed to put it into strategic reserve if you want. But when you do that, because it no longer has the aircraft, it will count its points against your strategic reserve cap. Once you deploy it on the field, it counts as a normal vehicle. The difference is it's going to say across the board that all hover units have a move stat of 20 inches. This is not a minimum 20, this is a maximum 20. So you can stay put and hover in place. You can go any number of inches up to 20, but not more than. As it is hover, that also removes its restriction to do other move actions than normal move. So it will now be able to, and sometimes required to, fall back. It will also allow it to advance and maybe get an extra d6 on top of the 20 inches. Things like that. So, complicated one. It's a little weird and it's going to get errated, but I don't think it's so
is it move
egregious that we can't figure it out.
So is it move and then pivot now?
Correct.
Instead of
it is
pivot?
move in a straight line, your minimum 20 or more, and then you get a single 90-degree pivot in each.
So your pivot is going to be at the end of your movement instead of before. Okay, that's one thing into itself. I just wonder if there's going to be ways to change in or out of hover mode via some special rules or something.
So it's going to have to be via a special rule, because as the wording in the core rulebook is written right now, and it actually calls this out a little hard, so it's trying to be clear. Hover is declared as a part of your deployment, and it's basically stuck in hover for the whole game. However, it is not saying that it's a part of your list build, so you can see what your opponent's playing. You can make that decision at the table, not during your list build. So if you're at like a tournament or something like that, you could go hover game 1 and then aircraft game 2. You can make that choice based upon seeing what your opponent's playing. Though once you decide that for the game, you are stuck that way the whole game.
Gotcha. Okay. Anything else on this one?
Nope. I think we're good. Like I said, this one's a little complicated because there's a bunch of changes, and then also there's some weird interactions with reserves and strategic reserves. Keep in mind, if you're going to play these, I don't feel like you can't because of the weird, we need an errata thing. Please feel free to play that, because especially if you're playing casually, no one's going to be upset about you playing a flyer. That being said, if you decide to play a flyer, especially if you're going to put it into hover, things like that, double check and reread these rules, because between the reserves and strategic reserves and the change to movements and the fact that it may or may not be on your data sheet, we'll find out as we go. You're going to want to kind of brush up on these before you actually play.
Okay, sounds good.